28,000 feet. That is how far the world drops away beneath the surface of the Bermuda Triangle. Down here, there is no light. There has never been light, not since the ocean was born. There is only black water, pressing inward from every direction with the weight of 1,000 atmospheres. At this depth, the sea is not a place, it is a force. And it does not forgive machines, it does not forgive men. Some things that fall into this darkness were never meant to be found, and most of them never are. To understand how a submarine could vanish without a trace, you first have to understand the dark. At the surface, the Atlantic looks blue and endless, but begin to descend and the color bleeds away within minutes. By 200 feet, the warm light is already gone. By 600, the last of the blue dies completely and the water turns to ink. The temperature falls toward freezing and stays there. Below that lies a realm sunlight has never touched in the entire history of the planet. No plants, no day, no night, no seasons. Only an eternal, suffocating black that stretches down for miles. And at the deepest point of the Atlantic, here in the Puerto Rico Trench, that blackness plunges almost 5.5 miles straight down. The thing that will kill you down here, long before the cold or the dark, is the pressure. Water is heavy, deceptively, monstrously heavy. For every 33 feet you descend, another full atmosphere stacks onto whatever lies below. By a few hundred feet, the force is already enough to make a steel hull groan. At the bottom of this trench, the pressure climbs past 12,000 pounds on every single square inch, the weight of a stack of cars balanced on a coin. A human body exposed to that would not drown, it would be crushed flat, instantly, into something the ocean would never give back. This is not a hostile environment, it is an executioner. And the only way to survive a visit is to wrap yourself in a machine strong enough to hold the dark at bay. For centuries, sailors have given this stretch of the Atlantic a darker name, the Bermuda Triangle. Ships that sailed in and were never heard from again. Aircraft that fell silent from clear skies. The legends speak of magnetic anomalies and forces beyond understanding. Most of that is myth. The sea has never needed the supernatural to kill. It has gravity, it has pressure, it has a cold and patient hunger. But the legend survives for one honest reason. The deep Atlantic keeps its secrets better than almost any place on Earth. What sinks here does not drift back to shore. It falls into a darkness so total that recovering it can take decades, if it is ever recovered at all. And in the spring of 1968, this graveyard was about to claim something the world was certain could never be lost. Because in 1968, this ocean was not empty. It was a battlefield, a silent, invisible front in the most dangerous standoff in human history. The Cold War had turned the deep Atlantic into an arena, and the deadliest competitors in it never broke the surface. Beneath the waves, came with no referees and no survivors of its mistakes. These were not the diesel boats of the last war. They were nuclear-powered predators, able to stay submerged for months at a time, each one carrying enough force to erase a city from the map. They slipped through the black water, listening, hiding, stalking. A single submarine, in the right position, could tip the balance of a war. And both sides understood a quiet, terrible truth. Out there in the crushing dark, their machines were beginning to disappear. 1968 would become the worst year in the history of the submarine. It began in January, when an Israeli boat, the Dakar, vanished in the Mediterranean with all hands. Days later, the French submarine Minerve disappeared off Toulon and was simply gone. In March, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine, K-129, was lost in the Pacific under circumstances Moscow would deny for decades. 4 navies, 4 submarines, hundreds of men, swallowed by the sea within a single year, each loss wrapped in its own secrecy and silence. It was as if the ocean itself had turned against the machines that dared to challenge it. And the 4th disappearance, the one that would haunt the United States Navy for the rest of the century, was still to come. Her name was Scorpion. The USS Scorpion, hull number SSN 589. She was a skipjack-class attack submarine, long, sleek, and shaped like a teardrop of steel, built for one purpose above all others: speed. In her prime, she was among the fastest things in the entire ocean, fast enough to run down almost anything beneath the surface and vanish before it could respond. She was a marvel of American engineering, a nuclear heart driving a hull designed to live in the dark. But a submarine is more than steel and a reactor. A submarine is not the men inside it. And inside the Scorpion, sealed away from the sun, lived 99 of them. Her commander was Francis Atwood Slattery, 36 years old, an officer his men trusted without hesitation. And trust, on a submarine, is not a courtesy. It is the only thing keeping you alive. These 99 men lived pressed shoulder to shoulder inside a steel tube barely wider than a hallway. They breathed air scrubbed and recycled by machines. They slept in narrow bunks stacked inches from live torpedoes. For weeks at a time, they never saw daylight, never felt wind, never knew whether it was noon or midnight in the world above. To endure that, a crew cannot stay a collection of individuals. It becomes a single living organism, every man depending utterly on every other, each one a moving part in a machine that breathes. And every one of them had made the same quiet bargain with the dark. That bargain was this: above your head, hundreds of feet of water. Around your body, a steel hull, perhaps an inch thick. That metal skin is the only thing standing between a warm, breathing crew and a pressure that would fold the entire vessel like a sheet of paper. Every submarine carries a number its engineers do not like to speak aloud: the crush depth. Cross it, and the hull does not spring a leak. It does not slowly flood. It implodes. In a few thousandths of a second, the ocean drives inward faster than a human nerve can carry the signal of pain. There is no scream. There is no time. The men aboard the Scorpion knew this number intimately. They lived just above it, every hour of every day, separated from instant oblivion by rivets and welds and the patient hum of a reactor that never slept. And they learned to ignore the deep groan of the hull flexing around them in the dark. They had to. The alternative was to lose your mind. By the third week of May, 1968, the Scorpion was going home. She had spent weeks deployed in the Mediterranean, shadowing Soviet vessels, and now she was driving west across the Atlantic toward Norfolk, Virginia. In the homes of her crew, calendars were already being marked. Families were counting down the days. The men sent their routine transmissions across the miles, coordinates, status, and the ordinary language of sailors who fully expected to be home within the week. On the night of the 21st, the Scorpion radioed her position, somewhere southwest of the Azores, and reported that all aboard was well. She was running deep and fast for home. 6 days, and she would tie up at the pier. 6 days, and 99 men would walk back into the sunlight. And then, the most ordinary thing in the world happened. Nothing. No further messages came. No alarm sounded. No distress call broke the silence of the deep. The most advanced underwater hunting machine the United States possessed simply went quiet and slipped beneath the dark and did not answer when her country began to call her name. At first, there was no panic. Submarines run silent. Silence is their craft, their camouflage, their entire purpose. For days, the Navy assumed she was only doing what she did best: listening, hiding, and saying nothing. But the days stretched on. The pier at Norfolk stayed empty, and slowly, a colder thought began to take hold. The Scorpion was not hiding. The Scorpion was gone. But the ocean had not been as deaf as it seemed. Hidden along the floor of the Atlantic lay one of the most closely guarded secrets of the entire Cold War: listening in the dark, a network of underwater microphones called SOSUS. It was built to hear the heartbeat of every enemy submarine that dared to move through the deep, and it heard almost everything. And when investigators finally went back through its recordings, searching the exact hours the Scorpion fell silent, they found something waiting on the tape. Not the blast of an enemy torpedo, not the signature of an attack. Something stranger and far more disturbing. A sequence of sharp acoustic events, one after another, compressed into less than 3 minutes. A pattern so bizarre that the first men to hear it could not explain what they were listening to. It would take years and the obsession of a single brilliant and haunted scientist to finally decode that sound. And when he did, the story it told about the last 90 seconds of the USS Scorpion would be more terrifying than anything her 99 men could have imagined in the dark.
821 nautical miles.
That is how far away the machine was sitting when it heard the Scorpion die. A single hydrophone, anchored in the black water off the Canary Islands, is built for one purpose: to listen for the sound of Soviet missiles. On the 22nd of May, 1968, at 42 minutes past 6 in the evening, it heard something else. A sound that traveled more than 800 miles through the deep, was faithfully recorded onto a reel of magnetic tape, and then was forgotten. For 5 months, no one understood what was on that tape. It was the sound of 99 men dying, and it was hiding in plain sight. On the 27th of May, the Scorpion was due home. Norfolk waited. She did not come. By that evening, the Navy issued the signal every submariner dreads: submiss, submarine missing. And the search began in exactly the wrong place. Everyone assumed she had gone down close to home, somewhere off the eastern seaboard of the United States, in the final stretch of her voyage. Ships and aircraft swarmed the coastal waters for days. They found nothing. No oil slick, no debris, nobody. The most powerful navy on Earth threw everything it had at the Atlantic, and the Atlantic gave back only silence. The Scorpion had not sunk near home at all. She was lying somewhere out in the deep ocean, thousands of feet down, and no one had the faintest idea where to look. And then, one man changed the entire search. His name was John Craven. He was the chief scientist of the Navy's Deep Submergence program, a brilliant and difficult mind who thought in probabilities where other men thought in certainties. Craven was already a legend in a world few people knew existed. 5 years earlier, he had helped find the wreck of the USS Thresher, another lost American submarine. 2 years after that, he had located a hydrogen bomb lost on the floor of the Mediterranean after a mid-air collision, using little more than mathematics and the educated guesses of experts. Craven did not believe the Scorpion had been lost near home. He believed she had died far out in the open ocean, and he believed that somewhere, in the vast listening network the Navy had strung across the Atlantic, something had heard it happen. He was right. As the Scorpion had crossed 3,000 miles of ocean on her way home, she had passed within range of secret hydrophone stations designed to catch the faintest whisper of an enemy. One array sat near Newfoundland, another listened from the Canary Islands. When Craven's team pulled the recordings from the hours the submarine fell silent, they found it. Buried in the noise of the entire Atlantic was a signature that did not belong to any ship, any storm, any natural thing in the sea. It was sharp, it was violent, and it repeated, again and again, in a pattern that made the men who studied it go cold. They were not listening to an accident in progress. They were listening to a recording of the exact moment a submarine was torn apart by the ocean. Slowed down and analyzed, the recording revealed something almost unbearable in its precision. The destruction of the USS Scorpion had not been instant. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It had a duration. From the first strange sound to the final collapse, the event lasted just 91 seconds. 91 seconds, captured forever on tape. 800 miles from where the men aboard her took their last breath. To understand what those 91 seconds contained, you have to listen the way Craven's team did, slowly, carefully, one terrible sound at a time. It begins with a single event, one sharp acoustic pulse rising out of the background hiss of the deep. Whatever it was the trigger, the first domino in a chain that could not be stopped. We will return, in time, to what that first sound might have been, because everything that follows flows from it. In the seconds after that first pulse, the Scorpion began to lose her fight with the ocean. A submarine survives by holding a perfect balance against the crushing weight of the water around her. Break that balance, and there is very little time. The boat began to sink, nose tilting toward the abyss, dropping through the dark faster and faster, carrying 99 men down toward a depth their hull had never been built to survive.
Every submarine has a limit, a depth at which the pressure finally wins. For the Scorpion, that limit lay somewhere around 1,500 feet. As she fell past it, the ocean did what it had been waiting to do since the day she was launched. The pressure hull failed. Not slowly, not with a leak. It collapsed inward in a fraction of a second, the steel folding under thousands of pounds of force, the air inside compressing so violently that it would have flashed to fire. For the men aboard, there was no drowning, no struggle, no final moment of fear. The end came faster than the human mind can register. One instant they were alive in the dark. The next day, they simply were not. And the hydrophone, 800 miles away, recorded the sound of it as a single brutal spike on the tape. But the tape did not stop there. After the first great collapse came more. A train of 19 separate acoustic events marched one after another across those 91 seconds, each one another piece of the submarine giving way as the wreck plunged deeper into the abyss. Compartment after compartment imploded under the rising pressure, the boat coming apart section by section as she fell. To the analysts, the pattern sounded like a slow-motion train wreck echoing across the ocean floor. It was the methodical, mechanical sound of a great machine being unmade by the deep. And when the last of the 19 events faded into silence, the USS Scorpion had ceased to exist as a submarine. What remained was wreckage, still falling, 2 miles down toward a floor no human eye had ever seen. Now Craven had the sound. What he did not have was a location. But sound in the ocean obeys rules. The same noise reaching two distant listening stations arrives at slightly different times, and from that difference, you can draw a line. Cross two lines, and they meet at a single point. Craven sat with a chart of the entire Atlantic and drew his arcs by hand, curve after curve, narrowing the impossible expanse of ocean down to a single box of water. When he finished, he turned to the men in the room and told them, with absolute certainty, that he had found the final resting place of the USS Scorpion. The box he had drawn was 400 miles southwest of the Azores, 12 miles by 12 miles. In an ocean of millions of square miles, he had found a needle. But even a box 12 miles wide is enormous when the wreck lies 2 miles down in total darkness, and you have a single ship to search it with. So Craven did something almost no one had tried before. He turned the search into a game of probability. He gathered experienced submarine commanders and asked them to imagine in detail every way the Scorpion could have died and where each scenario would have left her. He divided the seafloor into a grid and assigned to every square a number, the chance the wreck lay there. Then he sent his one ship, the research vessel Mizar, to drag her cameras across the squares most likely to hold the dead. It was painstaking. It was slow. The Mizar towed her sled back and forth above the abyss for weeks, photographing nothing but empty mud and black water, frame after frame after frame. And then, at the end of October 1968, more than 5 months after she vanished, the camera found her. There, 2 miles beneath the surface, in a darkness that had never known light, lay the shattered remains of the USS Scorpion. The hull had been torn into sections. The forward part of the boat had been driven down into the seafloor by the force of the implosion and the long fall. She was no longer a submarine. She was a debris field, a scar across the ocean floor, surrounded by the silence of a place where nothing moves and nothing hurries to decay. The mystery of where the Scorpion lay was finally over, and the men of the United States Navy stared at the photographs and felt the first cold edge of a far worse question. Because finding her had answered nothing about why she died. The tape held a beginning, that single first sound, 91 seconds before the end. And everything depended on what that sound truly was. Craven listened to it and heard a machine failing. An accident, born inside the boat itself, that had doomed her in a matter of seconds. But he was not the only one who heard that tape. Other men, listening to the very same recording, heard something entirely different. They did not hear an accident. They heard a launch. They heard evasive action. They heard a weapon in the water. And they became convinced, with evidence of their own, that the USS Scorpion had not been killed by the ocean at all, but hunted down and destroyed in the most dangerous waters of the Cold War. 2 men, 1 tape, 2 completely different stories of how 99 Americans died. And only one of them can be true.
11,000 feet. More than 2 miles of black water stacked overhead. This is where she came to rest. Not on a reef, not on a slope a diver could ever reach, but on the abyssal plain of the open Atlantic, in a place harder to visit than the surface of the moon. There is no current here to disturb her. No light has ever fallen on this ground. The temperature hovers a few degrees above freezing, and the pressure presses down at nearly 5,000 pounds on every square inch. For 5 months, the world had searched for the USS Scorpion. Now, at last, they had found her. And what waited on the seafloor was not a submarine. It was a crime scene that no one could yet read. At the end of the last chapter, we left 2 men staring at the same recording, hearing 2 different stories. An accident inside the boat, or a weapon in the water. To decide between them, words and waveforms were no longer enough. Someone had to go down and look at the body. But reading the evidence meant reaching a wreck more than 11,000 feet beneath the surface, in total darkness, under a weight of water that would crush any ordinary vessel like an eggshell. In 1968, almost nothing on Earth could go that deep and come back. The grave of the Scorpion had hidden her secrets for half a year. She was not going to give them up easily. The first eyes to find her belonged to a machine. The research ship Mizar dragged a camera sled on the end of miles of steel cable, lowering it down through the dark until it drifted just above the seafloor. Down there, the sled's lamps could push back the blackness only a few feet at a time. Its cameras fired half-blind, 1 frame every few seconds, capturing tiny squares of mud and shadow that would not be developed and studied until the ship returned to port. It was like trying to map a city through a keyhole in the dark while being dragged past it on a rope. For days, the sled saw nothing but empty sediment. And then, on a single frame, in the corner of the dark, a shape appeared that did not belong. Torn metal, straight edges where nature makes none. As the cameras passed over it again and again, the truth assembled itself frame by frame. There was no intact submarine down here. There was a debris field. The Scorpion had not simply sunk. She had been broken into pieces and scattered across the ocean floor. 2 great sections of her lay separated by roughly 150 feet of mud, each one having gouged its own deep scar into the seabed where it struck. The forward part of the boat, carrying the torpedo room, lay in one place. The after part, carrying the engine spaces and the reactor, lay in another. And between and around them, strewn across the dark, was the wreckage of everything that had once held the 2 ends together. The middle of the submarine was simply gone. The operations compartment, the heart of the boat, where men had stood watch and steered her toward home, had all but disintegrated. Most of the debris scattered across that field had once been that single compartment, blown apart and flung outward into the dark. The sail, the tall fin that had risen from her spine, had been torn off entirely and lay on its side roughly 100 feet from the bow. And in one small, haunting detail, the cameras caught one of her running lights, locked in the open position, as though for one final moment she had been a ship riding on the surface, showing her lights to a world she would never see again. Photographs were not enough. The Navy needed human eyes on the grave, and so they sent down the only thing that could carry them there. The Bathyscaphe Trieste, the second, a deep diving vessel
built to survive pressures that would flatten anything else. Her descent was its own kind of horror. Hours of falling, straight down, into a darkness so total it seemed to press against the tiny viewport. The water outside cooled and thickened with depth. The only sound was the hull ticking as the pressure climbed. And then, after more than 2 miles of nothing, the lamps found the seafloor, and the men inside became the first human beings to look upon the Scorpion since the day she died. What they saw, none of them ever forgot.
The destruction was almost beyond comprehension. When the pressure hull had collapsed, far above, it had not simply crumpled. The implosion had driven the after end of the submarine forward into itself with unimaginable violence. The engine room had been telescoped, rammed bodily into the machinery and reactor spaces ahead of it, the steel folding and compressing as though a giant fist had crushed a tin can from one end. Investigators would later calculate that some of that metal had moved at over 1,000 miles an hour in the instant of collapse. The entire underside of the boat had been torn away. This was not the gentle settling of a sunken ship. This was a machine that had been destroyed twice over. First, by whatever started the chain of events, and then by the ocean finishing the job. And yet, in the middle of all that ruin, one part of the Scorpion held. The reactor compartment, the nuclear heart that had driven her across the world, lay on the seafloor, essentially intact. It is still there today. The United States Navy returns to this spot again and again across the decades to take samples of the water and the sediment, watching for any sign that the reactor, or the 2 nuclear-armed torpedoes still aboard, have begun to leak their poison into the sea. So far, the answer has always been the same. The reactor holds. The weapons hold. Which means the grave of the Scorpion is not only a tomb, it is a sealed nuclear vault, resting in the dark, that the Navy will have to watch over for longer than any of us will live. Because it is, before anything else, a tomb. 99 men went down with her, and the deep does not return what it takes. When the survey crews studied the debris field, they slowly understood that they were not the only ones there. Among the torn steel and the scattered ruin of the boat, the record notes a single human figure, lying in the open, on the floor of the abyss. There is no need to dwell on it, but it should never be forgotten. This is not a puzzle made only of metal and sound. This is the resting place of 99 fathers, sons, and husbands who kissed their families goodbye and sailed into the dark and never came home. Everything that follows, every theory, every argument, is an attempt to answer the only question those families ever truly asked: why? And so the investigators turned to the bow, to the torpedo room, because if there were an answer to that question, many believed this is where it would be found. One of the oldest theories held that a torpedo had exploded inside the Scorpion, that one of her own weapons had detonated and torn her apart from within. If that were true, the forward section should have told the story plainly. A warhead going off inside that compartment would have set off the torpedoes stacked around it in a chain of sympathetic explosions. The entire bow would have been shredded, blown into unrecognizable fragments. But that is not what the cameras showed. The bow was damaged, yes. It was offset, knocked off the center line of the hull, partially separated, its hatches torn away. But it was not shredded. It was not blown apart from the inside. The single most important piece of the puzzle did not match the theory it was meant to prove. This is the moment where the story of the USS Scorpion stops being a simple tragedy and becomes something stranger. The physical evidence, the actual wreckage on the floor of the Atlantic, refused to fit neatly into any of the easy explanations. It was far too violent for a quiet flooding accident, yet it lacked the catastrophic internal blast you would expect if her own torpedoes had killed her. So a formal Navy Court of Inquiry was convened to study all of it. The acoustic tape, the photographs, the debris field, the strange and stubborn state of the hull. These were experienced officers, men who understood submarines and explosions and the sea. They weighed the evidence for months, and when they were finished, they wrote down a single careful sentence about what the best evidence actually showed. They concluded that the most likely cause was an explosion of large charge weight originating outside the pressure hull of the Scorpion. Read that again. Not a fire in the torpedo room, not a battery venting its gases, not a pipe bursting in the engine room, an explosion of large charge weight external to the hull. Something had gone off in the water beside her. And then something happened that has never been fully explained. A senior admiral, reviewing the court's report, simply struck that conclusion out. He set aside the finding of his own investigators and replaced it with a quieter story, a tale of internal flooding and mechanical failure, an unfortunate accident with no enemy and no blame. The court's verdict about an external explosion was buried. The full records were locked away from the public for the next 25 years. The Navy's own inquiry had found evidence that something detonated in the water beside the USS Scorpion, in the most dangerous waters of the Cold War, and someone, far above that court, decided the world was never meant to know. One sentence. That is all it took. The Navy's own court of inquiry had written that the best evidence pointed to an explosion outside the hull of the USS Scorpion. And one senior officer, reviewing their work, set that sentence aside and replaced it with a quieter story. Then the United States Navy did something stranger still. It took nearly everything it knew about how 99 of its own men had died, sealed it inside a vault, and kept it there for 25 years. A quarter of a century of silence, while families grew old, still asking what had happened to their sons. And one question hung over all of it, refusing to go away. If the death of the Scorpion was nothing but a tragic accident, then why was the United States Navy so determined to bury it? The answer did not come until 1993, when the court's findings were finally declassified. And what they revealed was not what most people expected. The court had not blamed a storm or a simple flood. Based on the acoustic record and the photographs of the wreck, it was concluded that the most likely cause was an explosion of a large charge weight outside the pressure hull. But here is the part the conspiracy theories always leave out. The court did not point that finger at the Soviet Union. The officers who studied the evidence believed the explosion had come from one of the Scorpion's own weapons. To understand how they reached that conclusion, and why others reached very different ones, we have to weigh three theories: one of war, one accident, and one of negligence. The first is the theory that will not die, the kill theory. It begins 2 months before the Scorpion's loss, when a Soviet submarine, the K-129, sank in the Pacific with all hands. The Americans knew, and in absolute secrecy, they had begun planning to do the impossible: to reach down miles into the ocean and steal the Soviet wreck from the sea floor. According to this theory, Moscow learned of the plan, perhaps through a traitor inside the US Navy named John Walker, who for years sold the Soviets America's most secret codes. And so, the story goes, when the Scorpion sailed too near a Soviet flotilla in the Atlantic, a Soviet submarine hunted her down and destroyed her. A silent act of revenge, in a war no one would ever admit was being fought. It is a thrilling story, and it seems to explain the secrecy and the buried finding. Some go further still, claiming the two superpowers struck a quiet bargain to bury their lost submarines and never speak of them, for fear of where the truth might lead. But the kill theory runs into a wall it cannot climb: the evidence. Atlantic Fleet officials testified that no Soviet submarine was anywhere near the Scorpion when she died. The wreck carries no signature of an enemy torpedo strike. The supposed deal between superpowers has never been shown to exist. And most telling of all, the Navy's own secret court, the very body accused of covering up a Soviet attack, did not blame the Soviets at all. It blamed an American weapon. If this were truly the story of a murder, the cover-up forgot to name a killer. Which brings us to the second theory, and the one the court itself believed: that the Scorpion was killed by one of her own torpedoes. We know that just months before, in December of 1967, the Scorpion had survived a hot run, a torpedo whose motor activated by accident while still inside the boat.
That time, Commander Slattery shut it down. The court imagined it happening again and reconstructed the scenario in chilling detail. A Mark 37 torpedo, sitting in its tube, fully armed, its safety guard removed, when the battery inside it springs to life on its own and the weapon begins to run hot in the dark, inches from the men who were meant to fire it. For years, the assumption was that this torpedo had then exploded, that its warhead had detonated and torn the Scorpion apart. But the wreck refused to confirm it. A warhead packed with hundreds of pounds of high explosive should have obliterated the bow and set off every torpedo stacked around it in a chain of secondary blasts. Instead, the forward section was found damaged but recognizably whole. The catastrophe that theory demanded was simply not written into the steel. So the question shifted away from the explosive in the torpedo's nose and towards something smaller, quieter, and far more sinister, hiding deeper inside the weapon. The battery in its belly. Because that battery, it turns out, had a secret. And the most disturbing part of the whole story is that the Navy already knew exactly what it was.
This is what the Navy buried. In the middle of May 1968, just days before the Scorpion sailed to her death, a Navy engineer sent an urgent warning up the chain of command. A type of battery used to power the Scorpion's torpedoes had violently exploded during a routine test, throwing flames into the air, all because a single thin diaphragm inside it had failed under vibration. The warning was explicit. It recommended pulling every one of these batteries from service as soon as possible, and it stated, in plain words, that the failure could generate enough heat to cook off a warhead and cause the loss of a submarine. That memo described almost exactly the death that may have been only hours away, and the command that received it did nothing. It did not warn the fleet, it did not warn the Scorpion. The memo went into a drawer, and the submarine went to sea. Put it all together, and the most likely truth emerges, quiet and devastating. One of those defective batteries, deep inside one of the Scorpion's own torpedoes, overheated and erupted. Not a warhead, but a fire, an explosion, smoke and seawater filling a compartment far below the surface. The crew fought it the way they had fought a hot run before. But this time, the boat lost her balance against the sea. She began to sink, slowly, then helplessly, down through the dark, past the depth her hull could ever survive. And at 1,500 feet, the ocean closed its fist. The explosion the court heard outside the hull was real. It simply belonged to the Scorpion herself. There was no enemy, only a flaw, a warning ignored, and the patient waiting in the dark. So this is what the Navy truly buried for 25 long years. Not a Soviet attack, something, in its own way, is harder to admit. They buried SOSUS, the secret listening system that had found her, because to explain it would have told the enemy how well America could hear. They buried the simple, humiliating fact that one of their own submarines could be destroyed by her own weapon. And most damning of all, they buried that memo, the warning they had been given and ignored, the single sheet of paper that suggested the loss of the Scorpion and her 99 men might not have been an act of God or an act of war, but an act of negligence. A cover-up, yes, but of shame and of secrets, not of murder. And still, after everything, the most important word in this entire story has never once been spoken aloud. To this day, more than half a century later, the United States Navy has never issued a formal verdict on what killed the USS Scorpion. The most definitive statement it ever made, released in 1993, spoke only of flooding and a cataclysmic event, and named no cause at all. It confirmed the death without ever naming the killer. In 2012, a group of submarine veterans, men who had served on boats just like hers, formally petitioned the Navy to reopen the investigation, to settle it at last for the families who were still waiting. The Navy refused, and so we are left exactly where we have always been, with a probable truth assembled from sound and twisted steel and a single buried sheet of paper. The most likely answer, never the certain one. It is easy in a story so full of theories to forget the men inside the steel. So before we leave the Scorpion,
Go back one last time to that pier in Norfolk on the day she was due home. Wives and children stood waiting in the spring air, with signs and flowers, watching the water for a submarine that would never come. 99 men, each one with a name, a family, and a life he expected to step back into within the week. To the people who loved them, they were never a mystery to be solved. They were everything. And many of those families would spend the rest of their lives waiting for an answer that never fully arrived.